Welcome to this week's On the Fly. I'm your host, Gene DeFilippo, and our guest this week is Michael Strickland, the Associate Commissioner of the Atlantic Coast Conference for Football. Welcome, Michael.
Gene, good morning. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks. You've been a busy guy lately. When you had three teams as late as the ACC did, and Cal Berkeley and Stanford and SMU, that certainly makes it a little bit more difficult for the person in charge of football. Tell us about it.
It certainly was a unique project, and one that had a definite due date expectation from the membership to reproduce a football schedule. But it was a terrific process and collaborative effort among the membership, both new and existing, to talk about what was important to the membership at 17 football teams, to build out a schedule rotation that would meet as many of our goals and objectives as possible.
What were some of the goals and objectives? Can you give us those?
Sure, Gene, happy to. For the existing membership prior to the decision to expand, certainly mitigation of travel was a point of concern for both existing members and new members that might enter the league in all sports. And so the commissioner challenged each of us at the sport administrator level to run some numbers on what that could look like for each of our respective sports. So in the sport of football, this is where math comes into the equation to run the numbers of what that would look like. So we were able to work that out for the existing 14 ACC football members, 3 trips to the West Coast over 7 years, and never doing so in consecutive seasons. And so the membership felt really good that from a football perspective, that would be a smart mitigation of travel. In addition to that, as we build the annual football schedules, as we did back in January for the 2024 season, the use of open dates in the football schedule, so that when teams on the East Coast do go west, that as many times as possible, you follow that up with an open date, so that they've got, particularly in the first couple years, as we learn the true impact of the travel, that we've got an open date in there for rest and recovery. And then doing the same for the new members. Obviously, they're making more trips to the East Coast 3 times per year, and doing so in a creative fashion. We've got this year both Stanford and Cal playing on a Friday night, so they've got all day Saturday to get back home and rest and recover for the following week's game. And then another one of their trips for each of them are followed by an open date. So 2 of the 3 East Coast trips mitigated in that regard. So that type of strategy was a core goal, objective, and solution to the travel concerns.
That's really a lot better than a lot of people thought what you were going to be able to do. And what that does is, when you play on a Friday, you can stay over that night and you can go back on Saturday. And the other thing is, if you have an open day, you don't have to fly back Saturday night. You can fly back on Sunday. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Now, how did you do it with rivals? I know that Stanford and Cal are going to be rivals, of course. I know more about Boston College than anybody, but Boston College has Pitt and Syracuse, who they've played more times than anybody else. What are some of the other rivalries that you kept?
This is where I give the membership and the athletic directors in particular a ton of credit, because they embraced this opportunity to be as creative as I think we've ever been in the football scheduling world for building a conference rotation. We were very honest with ourselves and recognized that certain schools have, the use of the word rivalry. We really defined that, and what meets the standard of rival and rivalry and what does not, in terms of, does the game have to be played every year? And if it met that standard, then we built it into the model. But if it didn't meet that test, then we didn't force ourselves to do so. And so that yielded a final rotation that certain schools don't have any teams that they play every year of the 7-year rotation that we developed. Others have, just one, some have two, some have three. And so we used the fact that we've got an odd number of teams to our advantage because it helps solve some of the math problems. And so over the course of 7 years, we've got teams within the league that will play each other as few as twice, but as many as 7 times. And that helped, back to your first question, Gene, in terms of the goals and objectives, mitigating travel, not just the number of times you traveled across the country, but playing as many games within your close to home footprint as possible. So, as you mentioned, Boston College playing more often the teams that are closer to them in the ACC footprint than those that are farther away was an additional measure that we used to both mitigate travel and put ball games on the field that players and teams and schools and fan bases were most excited to see. In an era of larger conferences, we actually were able to increase the percentage of games that our existing members would be playing against teams that were closest to them.
All right, take North Carolina and North Carolina State. They're very, very close to, Wake Forest and Duke. How do you work that out? How do you decide with the athletic directors which games have to be played and how often the 4 are going to get to play?
Well, my job at the start and throughout the process was to be a really, really good listener to the athletic directors, both those serving on the day-to-day subcommittee, and then the full athletic director group that we reported out to every other week throughout the couple months that we were working on the project. And ultimately building consensus with that group that the list of games that we had that must be played annually was the correct list. And we got to a really, really good spot there. North Carolina, the game on the football side of things, the game with NC State and the game with Duke, both very important to them. But uniquely in football, the game against Virginia is also very important to both Virginia and North Carolina. So that conversation led to those 3 opponents being North Carolina's 3 protected opponents. Differently for NC State, don't have quite the history with Virginia as North Carolina does. So that's where Wake Forest was able to enter the picture for NC State to be among 3 annual play rivals, along with Duke and North Carolina. So on honesty with the history of each matchup and what has meant most and more to each school yielded a great final product in our opinion.
Okay, explain to our listeners out here what a rotating football schedule is, Michael, and how you can put that together, because I have no idea of what it takes to satisfy 17 teams and to get them all in the right place on the right Saturday or Friday or Thursday or whatever it is.
Well, we're juggling a lot of different objectives, and you try to balance those as much as possible so that everyone feels like they got a lot out of it. Does everybody get everything that they want? I'm sure that nobody walked away from it feeling like they got 100% of exactly what they wanted, but I'm pretty confident that everybody got the vast majority of what they were hoping for. And also keep in mind, we've got to have a fair and equitable schedule because we're trying to identify the 2 best teams at the end of the regular season to play a conference championship game to crown a worthy champion. So balance and equity and strength of schedule matters. Certainly on paper is one thing, and how it plays out, in real life is another. But we do have historical data from a strength of schedule perspective to try to keep things as balanced as possible, not just for the 8 teams that you do play any given season, but the balance of home games versus road games from an on the field perspective. Then you've got, from the ticket office perspective, what's your home game inventory look like this year versus other years, and making sure you've got nice balance there. We talked about the mitigation of travel, so spreading out those longer trips in a concerted and strategic fashion. So a lot of conversation again with your membership to find out what's most important to them. And then you put it all into the pot and stir it up and come back with what you think is a good overall solution.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, who are Miami's rivals, who are Florida State's rivals, and who are Clemson's rivals, Michael?
Well, that's, you're going to have a pop quiz on me there. So for Miami, what's interesting is a couple years ago when we eliminated divisions, this is prior to expansion, but we eliminated divisions and consolidated, pardon me, into a 3-5-5 schedule. And of note, we received some criticism for the fact that Miami versus Virginia Tech was not a game that we were able to protect as an annual play in the final model. I'd say the same for Wake Forest, NC State. That game was not going to be played on an annual basis. But with expansion, we got a second bite at that apple, so to speak. So we were able to reinstate for Miami their annual series with Virginia Tech. We missed just the one season last year, but now we're back on schedule. And certainly we protected the Florida State series for Miami. So we were able to protect those two for Miami in particular, which was really important.
How about Clemson?
So for Clemson, their game with Florida State was the one that we thought was most important to protect. As you know, they've got an out-of-conference opponent in South Carolina. That's another key rival for them, and so we felt like they were in pretty good shape. And so the matchup with Florida State was protected, and then we're able to rotate Clemson, throughout the league in a more expedited fashion than we would have been able to if we'd put 2 or 3 annual plays on their schedule. Okay,
so Florida State will play Miami every year and Clemson every year.
That's correct. And so back to your earlier question about how do you construct the schedule, once you make that decision, then from balancing the other metrics, I think it's inferred, but you're going to want for Florida State the Miami game to occur at one site and the Clemson game to occur at a different site. So then you start to build the pieces of your puzzle on a team by team basis, so that you feel like as you go across each row of the final schedule and down each column, that if you put yourself into their shoes, do you feel like this is a fair schedule? Do you feel like it's an equitable schedule? Do you feel like their fans will be given a nice slate of home games and a nice balance of road games on an annual basis, knowing that there's going to be some waves along the way, but you just don't want huge spikes up and down over the course of what we chose in a 7-year rotation.
Let me ask you about SMU, simply because they are in Texas, which is halfway across the country or pretty close to that. Who did you put with SMU as their rivals, or did they have rivals coming in?
So we obviously spent a lot of time talking about all of this, and regarding SMU, we made the determination that a trip to and from Dallas was not something that really concerned us from a travel mitigation perspective, as you know, and you remember from your time at Boston College, making the trips, down to Coral Gables and back is already a part of the ACC footprint. So for most everybody on the East Coast, getting to Dallas is a 2.5 hour, 3 hour type of a trip. And so we thought that was manageable. So we made the decision not to protect, for lack of a better term, travel to and from Dallas in the way that we did decide to mitigate travel to and from, the Bay Area. And then as we built out the schedule, it made sense for SMU to be paired up with both Cal and Stanford in terms of permanent opponents. And so this is where, it's a transition from the use of the term rivalry to an annual opponent. They're not necessarily rivals yet, but hopefully those will develop. But it made sense and helped us in the overall construction of the scheduling rotation, and to mitigate travel for Stanford and Cal to both play SMU on an annual basis. That was going to cut down on travel for Stanford and Cal, and was also going to enable the ACC to keep intact the last week of the regular season for each of the 14 pre-existing members.
Right. A question here. You're dealing with ESPN and ABC. How much influence do they have in asking you, Michael, we would really like to have this game on Thanksgiving Day, this game the day after Thanksgiving? Who do you want to put on the Monday of Labor Day, how do you work with them to schedule when the teams will play?
Well, kind of a different approach there. So what we've been talking about was the development of a 7-year rotation, and so certainly, in Part A of that, certainly ESPN is as an all-in partner of the ACC and our biggest business partner involved in the process. What their input and feedback was important to us, but it was among the things we took into consideration. It wasn't, there's not necessarily veto power anywhere in the process other than at the athletic director, membership level. So we certainly had a good understanding of what was important to them and valuable to them in terms of the number of times teams would play one another and what type of annual rotation we wanted to build. And now Part B is to your more recent question is each January we build that year's schedule. So we know the rotation of opponents over a course of 7 years. Every January, we put those games into the actual schedule, weeks 1 through 13, or in certain years' case, 14 weeks. And so during that process, we work very collaboratively with ESPN to identify what the national landscape looks like on a week-to-week basis, and maybe where some of our best opportunities are if our teams perform, that they've got the chance for certain matchups to break through the clutter of national landscape of college football to be, the game of the week, so to speak. So, and we're trying to fill certain types of inventory windows with ESPN, certainly primetime ABC, noon, 3:30, ABC and ESPN, and then having a robust schedule for the ACC network. And so that is a much more coordinated and detailed process on an annual schedule development with ESPN's college football programming team than perhaps one would think we did with the construction of the 7-year rotation.
Michael, who's going to be playing on Labor Day weekend, and are there any games that you and ESPN want to feature?
So Monday night, Labor Day night, has been an asset of the ACC through ESPN for many, many years, and
Yes.
and that's a game that we work well in advance to schedule because of the football operations dynamics associated with it. Playing a game on Monday night, as you know, most seasons are a one open date season, so you wouldn't want to take your one and only open date in week 2 and then play 11 straight weeks. And so it's important to us that the two teams in the ACC that play the Monday night game, schedule their FCS opponent for week 2. Not that any game is a gimme, but wanting to mitigate the short rest nature of playing on a Monday night and then coming back and playing on Saturday. So we work with ESPN and our schools to set that rotation of games several years in advance. This year's game is Boston College at Florida State. And we were able to keep that one, I think, under wraps until we released our schedule in January. But that game had been selected several years ago so that both Florida State and Boston College could construct the remainder of their non-conference schedule, knowing that they were going to be playing a specialty game on a Monday night. And so we try to rotate as many different teams through that window as possible because it's a great opportunity for exposure, the only game of the day in college football. And it's done really, really well from a ratings and live attendance perspective for us over the course of almost 2 decades now.
Michael, the last few years we've had week 0. And a lot of people, I think, are confused with what week 0 means, and how do you get to play on week 0, but this other team doesn't start till week 1. How does all that work?
It's part of the beauty of college football, and then only in college football would we have something called week 0. Give us time, we might have a week -1. So week 0, there's NCAA legislation or permissiveness that restricts access, for lack of a better term, to week 0. It was originally intended for FCS football programs to have an opportunity to play on national television prior to FBS football starting their seasons on Labor Day weekend. And then it was added that there was an exception for Hawaii and Hawaii's opponents with the unique nature of travel to and from Hawaii to help Hawaii build a schedule, both conference and non-conference. They were given permission to play a week 0 game. And then anyone who played Hawaii was given permission to play a week 0 game because that would get you an extra open date. So the theory there is that, the week after you travel to Hawaii to help Hawaii build out a home schedule, that their opponent would have the ability to take the week off to mitigate travel, much like we talked about the ACC now doing with its membership in the Bay Area. So you had the FCS exception and then the Hawaii exception, and then subsequent to that, there was the international game exception as some of these overseas games started to come into the ecosystem for FBS football, certainly significant travel associated with that. So to enable that very unique student athlete opportunity and fan base opportunity, it was added to the exception. So if you play an overseas game, you can play that in week 0 so that you can, if you want to, take week 1 off and still have another open date the rest of the season or use it in the flow of the schedule. And the ACC has had membership that's taken advantage of that. Boston College played a conference game against Georgia Tech over in Ireland. This year, we've got 2 actually week 0 games with Georgia Tech and Florida State playing in Ireland, and then SMU will play at Nevada in week 0 through the Hawaii exception. So it's been a valuable tool to help people solve some scheduling issues from a travel perspective, and then certainly take advantage of once in a lifetime opportunities to play, take a trip and play a game in a place like Dublin.
Okay. Let's take ground zero. Let you and I look at this as coaches. All right. You are playing a game in week 0, and the rest of us can't start till week 1. That's a heck of an advantage for the team that's playing in week 0. Not just that they played a football game, but they could start practice a week earlier. So they're really getting a week more practice than a team that is beginning the season in week 1. Have the coaches, chimed in on that?
Certainly. I don't think any team has agreed to play an international game without their coach, being or getting on board with the idea, not just for that week, but to your point, how it impacts the overall season. There are some compliance nuances where you've got to give back a couple days later in the season. So the number of practice days gets amortized over the course of the season. But to your point, they are able to start a preseason camp a week earlier to get ready for the week 0 game. And you highlighted some of the benefits of that. But the coaches do spend a lot of time thinking about the unintended consequences of that. It makes for a particularly long season. And so even though you have to balance out the number of practice days throughout the course of the season, it's still an additional week that the players are in the grind of the season. It requires practice to start that last week of July, which for many programs overlaps with either the conclusion of second period of summer school, or it was traditionally the week between the end of summer classes and the start of August camp. And that was viewed as a valuable week for the players to be able to go home, spend time with their families, rest up, recharge before the grind of August camp. So there are pros and cons and to agreeing to do the week 0 games, which is why I think you've seen that programs do it every once in a while, and there's not robust desire to start the season across the board in week 0 because there are some trade-offs that have to be evaluated.
All right. I know you're in charge of football, but you're also involved in everything that goes on at the ACC. The question that I get more than anything else from just friends is, well, what are the Olympic sport teams going to do? Are you going to fly a team out to the West Coast to play a soccer game? Or how many times is a baseball team from Stanford going to have to come to the East Coast to play somebody? How did you work through that?
I'm fortunate we've got a great team here at the ACC, and I've got three tremendous colleagues: Paul Brazo on men's basketball, Jackie Carson women's basketball, and Jess Rippey on Olympic sports, and her great team in the championships department. And so, like we were put through our paces on football with our athletic directors to really evaluate exhaustively as many, if not all, options as possible. They were held to the same standard. And so Jess's team, to your question, Jess's team had to produce a number of different schedule rotation models for each of the sports and go through the exact same process that we went through with football to understand our goals and objectives, try to mitigate travel as much as possible, and be as creative as possible, all while having a competitively equitable regular season schedule so that you can crown a worthy champion both regular season and then feed it into the championship. So the use while and giving each sport the flexibility it needs or wants to do what's in its best interests. I think Jess involved the senior women administrators as a sport leadership oversight from the Olympic sports level. I think they heard a lot from each sports coaches groups and as well as student athletes about what was most important to them, what were their concerns. We also looked at what our programs had been doing historically. ACC schools had been traveling to the West Coast for non-conference games quite a bit more than you would have thought before you started the project. So there was some inherent comfort with playing on the West Coast. Olympic sports certainly very strong on the West Coast, and it's important to East Coast programs to have a brand presence on the West Coast from a recruiting perspective now and in the future. And so I think you're going to see the legacy ACC members, for lack of a better term, modify their non-conference scheduling because they're going to get once every other year that West Coast presence through the conference rotation. And so they're able to just slide some of those trips that were non-conference trips into conference rotations. You'll see travel partners in as many sports where it makes sense. And so if you're going to go west, you're going to play both Stanford and Cal in that trip. And the same for Stanford and Cal headed east. They would rarely, if ever, come east just to play one game. They would play a couple, and maybe they'll have back-to-back road trips around some times that they've got some time off from class with break periods to load up on road games. So we'll take advantage of the calendar and take advantage of travel partners and common sense as much as possible to mitigate the travel.
Okay, Michael, take men's and women's basketball. What you're saying is when an East Coast team goes west, they're going to play both Cal and Stanford.
And the model just got approved almost every time. There's a couple of exceptions over the course of several seasons in a rotation, but almost every time that would be the case, which will work nicely, and I think was viewed by the athletic directors as a tremendous solution to the challenge. What would you have submitted? What would have been on your mind as priorities that you would have wanted somebody like me to take into consideration?
I would, first of all, like to play on a Friday night rather than a Thursday night because it doesn't affect classes here at Boston College. That's one thing I would ask you. Another thing I would ask you is, make it as fair as you can regarding open dates prior to, different opponents. If you can balance it as good as you can. I'd like to not have as many road games at night, that are beginning at 7:30 or 8 o'clock that that means that the players are going to arrive home about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And, that's really tough on them. And I would ask you if we could play our rivals. At Boston College, we played Syracuse and Pittsburgh more than anybody else. I would ask you, since those games resonate with the three of us, Boston College, Syracuse, and Pittsburgh, that we play them. So those would be some of the things that I would think of that I could ask you.
And I would think people would be interested in the fact that we have a policy where we try to limit each football program or school to 3 requests each year in their football schedule. And you would have blown through. You had, I think, 6 or 7 different requests that are important to you, all very compelling for what you're trying to accomplish. And so the scale of it all, the magnitude, 6 or 7 institutional requests times now 17 institutions. That's a lot of goals that you're trying to deliver, and it involves one another helping each other out. For Boston College, your first request was to play a home game on a Friday night. Well, somebody's got to be there as your opponent, and how does that impact their schedule, and how from the week before and the week after, and their travel and the impact. So coordinating that and making sure that the Thursday and Friday night appearances are shared as equally across the league as possible, because while some view it as a benefit, in certain circumstances, particularly as the traveling team, it can be a little bit of a burden. So you got to make sure that is fairly done across the board. Playing your rivals is important to you, but not just playing them, but time of year and that last week of the season, and maybe around certain key dates of the calendar are important to each of the 17 schools. Being away or off for fall break, very important. At Boston College, having a home game the weekend with the Boston Pops concert on Friday night, very, very important. And we got about 1,000 there. So you got to identify. Our job is to understand your individual institutional needs and do that across the board 17 times, so that we know what we've got to deliver on, and we know where maybe you've got a little bit of flexibility in terms of all the things that you submit as requests.
If I gave you 5 or 6 requests and I got 3 of them, I'd be happy.
You'd be pretty happy. So only in sports will 50% get it done in scheduling, and we usually get about 65 to 70% of the requests accommodated. So we've got a pretty good batting average, but we certainly aren't perfect. And I'm not sure that there's ever been a schedule maker in sports that feels like he or she got it 100% right in a year.
I'll tell you what, just getting the right teams to show up at the right place at the right time, to me, that's mind-boggling what you do. Michael, you've been great. I really, really appreciate you being on our show. I learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners learned a lot. And, it's nice to hear all that goes into football scheduling, things that people just don't think about that you have to deal with. So congratulations on what you've done, and keep doing a great job in the future.
Gene, thank you very much. Enjoyed the visit today.
We're out of time on this week's podcast. I'm your host, Gene DeFilippo, and I want to thank our guest, Michael Strickland, for being with us and for really getting deep into how the football schedule at the Atlantic Coast Conference and other conferences is put together. It's not an easy job. To all of you out there, thanks for your time this time, and we'll see you next time.